Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Stevens, and I work with the European Organization Design Forum, and we're happy to have you all in this session today. Today, we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is organizations as living systems. So if you've worked in multiple organizations across different industries or cultures and locations, I'm sure you've noticed that none of them are quite like each other. They are as unique as any individual person with different histories and value systems and personalities. So our guest today has recently released a book founded in exactly this idea that our organizations are living systems, founded in a purpose expressed through physical, emotional, and cognitive characteristics. So I'd like to welcome Paul Lambert. He is the founding director of Living Work Consulting, where he helps leadership teams design client-centric operating models and create high-performance working cultures. He also heads the People and Org Change program at Henley Business School. Welcome, Paul. We're glad to have you.
No, delighted to be here, Heather.
Great. So you recently released a book, Alive, Cultivating Living Organizations for Success in a Digital Age. So one of the things that I notice in a lot of discussions about org design and development is this idea of an organization as a machine. It's very pervasive. People talk about organizational hardware and software, and sometimes you'll hear things like operating system. I personally, I'm a big believer in the idea of organizations as kind of more organic living systems that can't be reduced to the sum of their parts. So I'm curious to know what led you to believe in this paradigm of organizations and ultimately to write this book?
Yeah, great question, Heather. Part of it is just living it, isn't it? You said you're a great believer in it. I think it's 30 odd years of working life in professional services firms and working with clients across different industries. You can almost feel it as you walk in the building. I currently have a client, a law firm, which I think is a good example of a living system. Unlike a lot of law firms, I might add, nice kind of size law firm, 700 or 800 people. You get out the lift on the 7th floor of this building in London. You walk into their office. There's a lady on the there's 2 or 3 different people who sit on the sort of reception area, and it's, hi Paul, how are you? They remember you from last time. There's a greeting. How did your holiday to Lisbon go? And in the same building, ironically, is another client that I've worked certainly with one of the directors there in the past. And you get out, and there's no greeting like that. There's often somebody not on the reception desk. It's like, did we book the meeting room on the system, running around? And the feel is different immediately. That sort of and the conversations you have are different. The language is different. If you like, I'm going to contrast the 7th and the 8th floor. The 8th floor firm, it's like, what's the cost of that component of our organization? How can we benchmark it? How might we replace it? How might we automate that part, that piece? On the 7th floor, we've just literally delivered yesterday our report on how they deliver change. And there was a great deal of talking about, I won't mention the firm's name, but doing it this firm's way. They talk about values of bravery and kindness. The language is different, and people, and what's really noticeable is, to the title of my book, it feels alive. You talk to people, and even though there's some issues about how they're delivering stuff, they like each other. They want to be at this firm, and there's certainly not that sense of, I'm just a component in a big machine, and they want to preserve that. They're very clear about it. So I think it's lived. I know that was a longer answer to it, but it's like, if you like, the contrast between the living organization on the 7th floor and the more mechanical organization on the 8th floor as being a place where people want to work more. It brings out the best in humanity, and they're doing very well financially as a result of the entrepreneurial spirit and the freedom to operate that they have.
Yeah, I think in my own experience, I've worked with a lot of companies, and there is definitely like a mechanical sense of some that really comes through in sort of the dispassionate language, referring to people as resources and things of that nature, and sort of framing employees mainly as a cost and things like that. And then working for organizations where it really is, you feel connected to people and you feel connected to a common purpose, you do tend to notice people will they are more invested. They will kind of go above and beyond. They are thinking more critically about how do we sustain our mission and how do we make ourselves more resilient. And it feels a lot more, I think, personally satisfying as well, working in those kind of companies. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's where do you want to work? I kind of, thinking about the people who might be listening to this. If you think about either the organization you work for or the organization you've last consulted with or worked with, what I just ask people, how would you describe this place? Often in an image. I mean, a classic sort of, I guess, technique to uncover a lot more information, but it tells you a lot. It tells you a lot about how people feel, the connection. And you mentioned words. The language is entirely different. You kind of you mentioned it in an introduction about this connection to purpose. The physical characteristics, but the social and emotional connection, and all those kind of unique capabilities. Organizations have very different strengths, just like human beings.
yeah, that's what I find endlessly fascinating about doing this kind of work is every organization is different.
Yeah.
So in the book, you kind of drill down into these concepts in a way to make them more concrete and to kind of identify sort of specific mechanics and models. And you also present some principles that sort of elucidate this concept of organizations as living systems. I think, Milena, do you mind bringing up the slides? We have some slides. So I just want to, maybe you can talk us through the
I might
principles.
take a, I might go to this
Oh,
first, if
the
you don't mind,
model.
Heather.
Okay. Yeah, of course.
Um, so, because I want to talk about, I think the language is really important here, and to notice, I'm thinking for the benefit of people listening to this, it's like, what's the language our clients are using and we're using? So what you see on the left there is a view I have of living organization, which is to say, at the heart, and this is the words we might use as a human being, in our heart, our purpose, my purpose, I feel deeply motivated by this purpose. And we might say, I'm deeply moved to, improve the world of health and social care, or, bring out the potential in people or whatever. And that is expressed in, I think I gave the example recently in another interview of a friend who's a brilliant coach. They love to bring out the potential of people. That's almost like their purpose. And it's expressed in being a great coach, which is a mindset thing and some capabilities. They're great at coaching, the language of coaching, the cognitive, physically, and often as a sports coach, they ingrain that and they demonstrate that. And emotionally, they create an environment of a learning environment, lots of questions asked, lots of so that's for a person. Then I expect to see that in an organization. So in an organization which is perhaps very, very good at bringing a health or social care organization, one worked with in the past, they were very, very good at both bringing together the right kind of medical capabilities, the cognitive knowledge, physically, the actual environment, the systems and processes we can talk about. You can see there on the right some of those things we're talking about in the physical realm, the design, the client-centric processes around a patient pathway, for instance. And emotionally, it's the kind of culture mindset. And what they got right in this environment was really a mindset of about wellness, almost preventative care. So just like my friend Dave, the coach, we've got a healthcare system, and I won't again mention the name of the provider, but they'd really got that sense of purpose, this preventative healthcare for various conditions, particularly for people with physical disabilities, etc. And they had brought that together in a set of cognitive, physical, and emotional capabilities. So I think this is quite a simple model. In my teaching at Henley Business School, I often use the Galbraith organisational model, STAR, which I think is good, but I find even students relate to this even better in that it's a relatively simple model of how an organization's purpose and identity is expressed in these aspects.
Yeah. One thing that I notice in working with organizations is indeed these are simple ideas to grasp, but a lot of this behavior or sort of cultural artifacts, if you like, are invisible to the people who are living them and participating them in everyday life, and that organizations will sometimes struggle to understand why there are points of friction in certain things. And I think that there can be tension between each of these that is sort of um, not obvious. So if you have, we talk about congruence in org
Yeah,
design and development, and achieving
absolutely.
this sort of congruence between these elements can be quite powerful. But then if you don't have that congruence and you have friction and tension, it manifests as just things being a bit chaotic, but not everyone can kind of put their finger quite on why that's happening.
Yes.
Do you
Yeah,
recognize
yeah. I
that?
mean, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if we go back to the healthcare example, it was in an orthopedic setting, and it's like, it was where a kind of a system. It was a new orthopedic center, and where the there was a real vision in sort of putting that together. These people could have joints replaced and other operations, knee operations, etc. But it was a real kind of a patient pathway. There was the appropriate consultation before because they had such a clear identity and purpose. They had a very aligned group, but then it bumped into a traditional, more bureaucratic healthcare system with functions, doctors here, nurses here, allied health professionals here, other groups, and suddenly the bumps, that lack of alignment and a mindset of a system. The rest of the system was quite, we have a budget for this function, we have a budget for that function. So the physical organization of the system was very different, that it was getting some of those doctors and nurses from. So that's where the abrasion started to happen, literally.
Yeah, I sometimes will use the metaphor of it's sort of like if you get an ill-fitting pair of shoes and the friction may seem subtle at first, but it builds up over time and can cause blisters and abrasion. Indeed, I think is a good metaphor.
Yeah.
So shall we move to the principles? You have
Yeah,
7 principles for living
indeed.
organizations.
So where I started with this, it's kind of like, if I often talk about in the book that our body and our world does it better than our organizations do typically. And our world is full of great examples of how intelligence is built in, natural intelligence is built into our biological system. So it started on the right here with, these are 7 well-known characteristics of biological life, about core identity, cellular structures, specialization, sensitivity to the environment and responsiveness to the environment, homeostasis, which is the big sort of biological word for keeping things stable, and in balance, dynamic balance often. Nature's better at that than just one set point, but dynamic balance, growth and evolution, reproduction. So I'll pick out some of these. I'll try and pick over these quite quickly to bring them to life a little bit, Heather. So purpose-driven, we've already talked about. I mean, it's proliferation, isn't it, in our organizations, where purpose and statements like Google to make all the world's information searchable. It was at one time, or the Tesla's talked about sustainable transportation in the future and things like that. So these words are used. The question is, do they really believe them, or are they just words on the wall? But I think one of the most important things about purpose, and I was talking to Henley Business School students about this last week, is it's discovered. A bit like we grow up and discover it. I've got 2 teenage daughters, and they've got very different talents. So I think it's discovered by nature of the group of people you brought together, often around an initial vision, to do something different, provide, whatever it is, great travel experiences. So that's number one, a discovered purpose we find together, and something resonates. We start talking and we go, Heather, it'd be great, wouldn't it? We love, I give the example, for instance, in the book, of Intrepid Travel. It's a travel company I love. They environmentally and community-based travel experiences. So you're close to, they do no damage to the environment, but you're close to communities and you build relationships. So a different kind of purpose. Second, and then our bodies build up in cell structures. And I've already mentioned sort of cognitive, physical, emotional embodiment of that. So out of that heart, the very essence of an organization grows those mental abilities, those physical systems and structures, and culture, mindsets, and a kind of an environment, a way of doing things together. Then we build up, out of that is unique capabilities. So the travel company, for instance, they're very good at, they have some unique capabilities. Obviously, they use local guides and get to know local communities. So they have more of a relationship, a partnership approach with their locations rather than booking a hotel, etc. So they have these capabilities, local guides, they understand the environment, they build up these unique capabilities. They also build up a great understanding of the different client groups as well. So they have this client intimacy, they have this intimacy with communities and with local guides who really understand the area, and of course all the other stuff about being a great travel company, great travel experiences. So a unique set of capabilities, lots written, I think, in literature about that. But this adaptation over time, in their case, the experience is it varies, whether it's in Asia. We went to Vietnam with them. I know somebody else who went to Peru, and things like the Inca trails and stuff like that, and they had a different experience. So they can vary their model a little bit by region. There's this kind of closeness to the environment. Then the whole thing about integration and balance. There's a lovely example in Jurassic Park where life is, if you talk to biologists, is always at the edge of chaos. Kind of, there's this sort of there's like when we walk, we're always slightly nearly falling over, but in a good organization, just like the body does, it's correcting. It's a hot day, we sweat and we cool ourselves down. The same thing in organizations. When the market changes or the environment changes, do we have organization? By its nature, a living organization is outside in rather than inside out. The problem with the machine one is it tends to be inside out. It's like this machine. Well, we built this beautiful machine. It's like a giant hammer and you must be a nail kind of thing. It's like you must have this machine. Whereas a living organization is constantly talking to customers, responding. The sixth one, which we might talk about a little bit more lately, but I found this real resonance in the market. It's led to a couple of pieces of work, actually, is organizations grow up. So I say a startup is like a toddler. And then we move into kind of a teenage stage. We start to get things together. We start to find, we get organized, but we're still, it can be, a growing potential, sometimes misdirected. How do we move on to the next stage, young adulthood effectively in organizations? And I've built up more detail in this in the book on, for instance, what that looks like in different organizations, say professional services at different stages. And lastly, what's talked about a lot, and I think quite a lot in the EODF more, is networked organizations. So this idea of reproducing who we are or connecting with other outside cells, if you like, to extend our offer. We've got platform organizations like an Uber, which is really a broker between systems, but we've got things like the Hire, Bertzog, others, which are examples of sort of that method of building up networked organizations. So I think these are all aspects over time. Some more, it starts with purpose. It almost starts with number one and grows into number seven, but it has all these features really. So that's how I tend to sum it up.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of kind of interconnectedness just in these principles in general as well. And thinking about adaptation, and we hear a little bit about organizational resilience and responsiveness to environment. I was reading a paper a little bit earlier that I think you referred me to, actually, by Arie de Geus.
Yeah.
If there's any Dutch people, I apologize for my pronunciation. He's a Dutch business theorist. He wrote a piece called Living Organization. It was published, I think, almost 30 years ago. And he reflects on the high mortality rate of organizations. And I was thinking about that as you were running through these, that we have
Yes.
companies that have existed for centuries, yet the average age of a corporation is a few decades. So many are not reaching their full potential, and many don't make it beyond adolescence, let's say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is where I think your book is really insightful, because you sort of identify at a more concrete level these dimensions of living in organizations and the mechanics of how adaptive change occurs. So I think we want to dig in a little bit to how does transformation happen,
Yes.
and maybe you
Just
can
if I
talk.
might make a comment, Heather,
Yeah, of
it's
course.
like being on a European organizational design forum call like this, I think one of the great things about being part of this community is we see this kind of growing up. We understand some of those stages, and just I've been playing with the analogy of us as consultants more like organizational parent. Sounds a bit sort of parent child. I want a sort of organizational friend, but kind of it's parent as a sort of that taking care of our organization.
Yeah.
And I think in our organizations a lot of care is taken about often profits and quite often customers, but actually are we looking after the growth and maturity of the organization where they fail? And the Ari de Goy's book, I think it's called The Living Company, I think, and it's the average age of a company is going down, not up.
Mm.
There's a famous study, Ari de Gois, I think, was part of the group at Shell, who looked at
Yeah.
living organizations and learning organizations, sorry, and like the Peter Sengiz and stuff like that. And it's this inability to learn, which is absolutely, again, I talk about in the book, the growth, the mechanisms for growth. And I think that's it's an opportunity for us as often as internal and external consultants, but it's also it's a forgotten role sometimes, and people don't look after their organization. And guess what? Like humans, it gets ill. Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah,
I definitely resonate with that. I like to talk about organizational stewardship.
yeah,
I like sort of the model of organizations as gardens as well, of that you're tending to a longer timeline than just whatever the next quarter's earnings are. And I think there's a lot of incentives in the modern economy to chase the next quarter's earnings, and that ends up being a bit
yes,
to the detriment of many of these companies, where they start to neglect that sort of collective learning aspect, and they want to just sort of hire someone to fix a problem rather than kind of do the process of thinking through and overcoming. I've definitely seen that in companies that I have worked
yes,
with or had friends who worked with. Um, So the core of how to sort of avoid this is then to be able to navigate transformation. So there's this idea that change is always happening around us, whether we want it or not. If you stand still for long enough, the earth is still turning on its axis. So how do we cope with that? So you have an interesting approach for this. Share it with us.
Yeah, I just, this picture is just put up to a little bit to conjure up an image in our minds. You and I talked about before, Heather. It's like this statistic about 70% of change and transformation efforts fail to achieve their outcomes. I looked it up for the book. I looked when that was last quoted by from McKinsey research about 5 years ago, but it was first quoted in McKinsey research about 35 years ago.
Oh, wow.
So we're not really improving very much. And this isn't just digging out the old stats. This is kind of looking at reports from their surveys, etc. And I think it is fundamentally because we still have that mechanistic view of I'm saying the world, often management can have a mechanistic view, which is, oh, it's great, so and so has a vision of how this will be, and tries to propagate it down some form of pyramid, some levels in the organization, some groups. So the diagram on the left is there to make that kind of point. But I think if you actually look at what works, I started looking at what works. The civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, was what worked there. Well, it was a network. It was kind of again, one of the things in the book, which I'll flick up in a second, is Barack Obama's famous election campaign, where he came from relatively unknown to go and win the election convincingly, sort of 20 plus years ago. It's like they thought about it different. They had network local activists and so these change movements. And so you see social movements, you see business movements, and there's that whole thing about things like total quality management went like that. Even we see agile these days. And a lot of those things, it is about a bottom-up approach or moving across this. So the model which I talk about in the book is, I call it the chain reaction model, but it's that starting from a little unit. I can see Jose's asked a question. I don't know whether we want to look at that or not.
I think we are going to get into this topic of how to lead change. One thing I wanted to comment that came to mind as you were talking about things like the civil rights movement is, I think when we look back on those things, a lot of popular history sort of portrays them as almost accidental, or that they just kind of grew on their own, when really, if you look into the kind of mechanics of those movements, they were quite strategic in how they approached things and how they chose people to be the face of certain the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King was specifically chosen because of his kind of facility with language and that he was a compelling figure. And so I think there's this idea when you talk about organizations as living systems where we understand emergence and we understand that we don't necessarily have control over very much, but then that doesn't mean that we're not able to positively influence change.
Yes. And change movements fail as well. As you say, Heather, actually, I think the civil rights movement is a very good example, because very judicious situations chosen, slightly provocative situations at time. If you read Martin Luther King's biography, deliberately, going to towns where there was a over-the-top mayor, where some specific incident would occur that would gain national attention and would be a pivot point in that movement. So noticing those things, yeah. I mean, I might, Heather, just go on to the Barack Obama thing a little bit more, just to make it real for people.
Yeah.
And many of you have you probably there's people on this call who've read I think The Audacity of Hope, isn't it, his biography? But they actually some of this is drawn from a parallel book by his Obama's campaign organizer called The Audacity to Win. And as you say, Heather, there's an intentionality about this. Barack Obama had a small team, around 10 people, that he chose to get this moving. He's a community organizer by background. So he understood some of the principles inherently, but he picked some people on the team. And the book mentions the specific names, but they one or two of them were really very, very good at kind of the messaging and the communications and the impact, both top level messages, but also local, specific messaging. Others about how we start to organize, how we start to place people in key places. So this full-time team, small team, crafting these messages, but starting to craft the design of a change network. So, bringing some people together from regional areas. So the full-time team got some of the national press, started getting budgets, etc. But then started bringing in people from the different states, and we had local teams. Some of these were community reps, these were still paid people, but they created a system called it's that slightly dodgy my BO, but it's MYBO, My Barack Obama. And for anybody who's really interested, you can go and see little training videos for it. But it was a system that these local teams could then galvanize, just like the national team had, of key voters, local voters, tracking them and knowing who they were and when they've been in contact. It's like a contact management system, but it was local contact. These were local conversations, it was knocking on doors. This wasn't, like many of the campaigns, just a big national advertising piece. This was meeting people, persuading them. Lots of volunteers started moving into that then. So we then have across various towns or cities across the state, these local teams being set up with one or two paid, not particularly well paid, community organizers. And then that's spreading in turn to people just doing this in their neighborhood. So we got the third wave here of volunteers and the grassroots movement. This is all happening within a 2-year period here, from early 2007 to 2008, to where it just became then cascades. But it was, as you say, galvanized. There was a system behind it. There was some real thinking. There was some understanding about the enabling stuff that needed to be done nationally for locally. So again, I talk about in the book some of the conditions for that change. But sorry, yeah.
I was just going to say, so I remember this vividly. I was quite active in politics when Barack Obama, when his campaign was being mounted. I think I was president of the College Democrats at my university. And I remember that some things that were notable about it was that it was a different campaign than anything that we had sort of seen before. So it was the second presidential campaign that I was active in. It didn't, it was sort of aligned with, but it was separate from the kind of traditional party apparatus of the Democratic Party, that it was a lot of people who it was their first time involved in a political campaign, and that it was kind of upsetting the conventional wisdom. I mean, of course, it was a very Hillary Clinton at the time was kind of the favored, sort of the person whose turn it was, so to speak. And I was in Iowa for the Iowa caucuses that year. And of course, Barack Obama being from Illinois, which is right next to Iowa, there was just a flood of volunteers. And I had a lot of friends who kind of got swept up by this movement, and that it indeed felt like people felt a sense of ownership, that it wasn't like a cult focused on the infallibility of one person, but it was really, this is us, this is all of ours. his slogan was, yes, we can. And so it was kind of emphasizing that collective, collaborative element. And I mean, it was definitely a good time to be a Democrat because I remember the day that he was elected. So it was definitely an example of a very transformative kind of campaign. And I think in a sense, it also sort of demonstrates as a sort of social phenomenon that the way that evolved and came to be, and the sort of strategic intent behind it, did not necessarily translate to longer term success for the Democratic Party as an institution. That the Democratic Party maybe didn't kind of capitalize on building those cycles in that same way of starting from the edges rather than having this kind of top-down apparatus.
Yeah, I
So
like your words, Heather, by the way, starting from the edges. There's that, the last little thing I'll show, because I know we want to make a bit of time for questions and going further with this, is trying to assimilate some of this, the learning from this. And I kind of, when I look at this, obviously I would obviously recommend the kind of classic books like Tipping Point, and there's now Revenge of the Tipping Point from Malcolm Gladwell, which I think gives some very useful hints about some of the key roles in this. But what I notice is, first of all, there is a critical mass. We need to get that. You on the receiving end, you say there's this mass of people moving from the next state, etc. Already some movements created, but we have to have a message. Yes, we can, as you say. The audacity of hope and change. We can, change we can believe in, kind of things. So that belief and fleshing that out a bit, there is a point, and I think this is a good leader like a Martin Luther King or a Barack Obama will see when that's taken enough root. So I think there's something here about, I've done this recently with a big international law firm, actually, just taken their people leadership team, and the number of people initiatives that have, we really need people to buy into everything from, the way that they recruit through their relationships, to the rollout of e-learning, but from the bottom up. So people, it's not that it's tailored to the local environment, etc. They're trying to sculpt the message about what is this, what do we do. So there's this critical, this is what it is, but then we've got to demonstrate it, and that's what I mean by react and release. It's like, I did this with a new service in a global management consultancy around workforce planning. I started with a little group who were really interested in it. One or two of us had done this kind of work in the past, and we formalized some basic materials about it. Then we went and did a couple of projects, and they were great. We'd done it before. We knew there was something there, and the market was ready for it. But they were great. So we did that. What I would call that react and release. It's like you use the message, you demonstrate something. This is critical mass. This has gone from a message to a bit of momentum. But then, having done those things, it was like, well, those were good. Those were good projects. But how can we scale that? How can we train others? So actually, our little gang of disciples, are kind of like a little community of practice, then became trainers for people. So we stabilized that. We wrote down some of the lessons we'd learned. We got the stories, and then those people actually, we were from different countries at this original group. They went back to their countries and effectively set up the same kind of group. So they built a critical mass, but just like the Barack Obama campaign, they set off. But now we've got a sort of common method, but we're doing it. There's 4 in parallel, and off we go. And we've got some more stories and more momentum expand. And you can see, so we went from sort of one country to multiple countries across regions, and then multi-region to global. With it's a number of cycles of change. So it is, just like the Barack Obama thing. It takes off. It's just all gone, and it's suddenly a movement.
Yeah, I noticed that when, so I have worked as an agile coach in a number of places, and so there is very much a bottom up element, and there is there is a point where it feels a bit like a slog, especially with teams that have kind of a history of being punished for experimentation and things like that. But there is a point where you sort of show people that they can influence and improve their ways of working and their working lives, and then it takes off. It really, so it can feel like, oh, I'm just trying and trying, and I'm going to keep at it and keep trying different things. And now when I enter companies, and I realize in the beginning it always feels like that, and I just keep at it because I know there's a point where it will happen, and it just sort of, it seems like it clicks. I want to,
It's hard though, isn't it? You've got a sort of certain belief and confidence that you're not totally in control of this. I think that's one
right.
of the key things. You've got the confidence, you know it's going to take off at some point. Whereas if you're nervous from management, you tend to go back to the triangular one
Yes.
because you control everything. And of course, controlling everything means you often get very little.
Well, I think it's also important to sort of resist the temptation to, I mean, so to be a little more concrete about it, one of the challenges of coaching teams like this is helping them to learn how to make decisions together, because in a more traditional format, their manager tells them what to do.
Yeah,
But an agile team really needs to learn to make decisions together. And there is a point where it's difficult, and maybe they will argue about every little thing. But if you give in to the temptation to just make the decision for them, it never gets easier. That dependency always exists. And so over time, with enough experience, I have learned never give in to that temptation. Just kind of keep trying different structures. Sort of, okay, they responded a little bit to this. I worked with a team once where, just as an experiment, I was like, why don't we vote? And they loved voting. And then they voted on everything after that. And then it was
yes.
very easy for them to make decisions. And who would have thought? Um,
And
I
I
want
think
to, yeah, go
I
ahead.
love that. I love that, Heather, because it's taking us. It's because that is, in a living system, we're back to. It's a lot more fun to be an OD consultant because you can be a lot more creative. You're an actor. You're a player in that. You can bring creativity. You can because you're responsive to personality because everything's not just a cog. We're not treating every person like a cog. We kind of go, well, as you said, this group of people, they really responded to voting in another, but the culture, in an engineering firm, I found a bit more data has
Yeah.
helped. But
Hmm.
in a media organization, more of a story. The
Yeah.
stories often work in many places, but I think it makes our life as change facilitators more interesting, more fun, and more and we have to be. I think there's a degree of emotional intelligence about reading the rooms and people that and if we look at a lot of the classic strategy consulting stuff, it's very head. It's very, it's just about the cognitive, like the whole world's totally
Yeah.
rational. We know the world's not always that rational.
Yes, exactly. So I want to get to, we have a question here from Jose, where he says, it's a bit like chaos theory, where at a certain point it cannot go back. So your traction is there, as you say, lots of cycles. So how to create this and identify the moment. I think this goes back to what we were saying before, because this is something I love about change is, where's the moment, where's the opportunity to capitalize on. So what do you think about that?
Oh, I've seen Jose's just made one more comment about it. It's a bit like chaos theory. So I think there are, that's another metaphor, if you like, the kind of new science for this. Um, um, how do you spot the moment? Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think taking the temperature of movement, it's like, I think you need to do tests every so often. You need some way of taking the temperature. So usually the way of taking the temperature, I think, is the point at which people will do something. So they'll move. the difference between the critical mass piece and the react and release is, okay, you're really excited about this whole workforce planning thing or this workforce transformation service. Let's go do a project. Are you up for putting up your hand for it? So I think you can do tests of the system. I think you can feel the temperature, to be honest, of that. You know, you can sort of, there feels right. It's almost a gut level as well as a head
Yeah.
level. But I think, I like all these things, it's art and science, and you neglect one and it'll catch you out, because you need some data.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to say how many of these projects have we done, but we also, you know, for instance, after I'd done my first couple of those projects, I did a case study session at lunchtime, and normally you get 5 or 10 people who got a bit of time. We had 50 people in because everybody was excited about this new project we'd done, which was like very different, and they wanted to work on it. And I thought, we're starting a movement here. We've got some momentum.
Yeah,
So
when I asked the question, I was also thinking like you just kind of feel it once you have
yeah,
the experience. And for me, one thing I've noticed is when I hear a lot of people talking about the same problem separate from each other is also a bit of a clue that there's some momentum to be had. Um, we have a question from Ulrika. Uh,
yeah.
is it suitable or desirable for every type of organization? Or do organizations have a natural tendency to develop into this model?
Um, so one of my beliefs, let me just give a little bit of personal history. A long time ago, I won't give out how old I am, but at university, I did organisational studies in my final year of my main degree. And I read a book called, which some of you may have read, called Images of Organisation, called by Gareth Morgan. And it gave 10 different images of organisation. The first was machine, the second one was living. But there are others. You know, he talked about things as great as psychological prisons, political systems. And so I think there is more than one image we can use, and they bring out different elements of it. So there's more than one way to look at an organization. That's what I'd say first as a caveat, Ulrika. But I think the power of this is it reflects life, and organizations are full of people, even ones that do manufacturing. They've still got a lot of people thinking and doing. So I think it's suitable because it reflects the underlying nature of the ingredients, if you like, which is people, the whole kind of people processes, but the world itself that they're interacting with, the wider community. So I think it is a very useful model, and I would suggest in many ways more useful than the slightly more mechanistic things. So I mean, I have questions about if you look at the Galbraith model, for instance,
Mhm.
it is a little bit mechanistic. He sort of he suggests almost that culture is an output of what you reward. Well, I think you can go straight for some of the behaviors and culture in an organization. And some other theorists say behavior is the fundamental. You know, it's like, so I think it's a good model to analyze all organizations with, but I wouldn't neglect all the other perspectives, because in a living organization, still it can become dysfunctional because of politics. So have a look at the politics and the power in it. And I think that's again, one wonderful thing about organizational development is whatever field you've come from, there's probably another insight you can get into it. But I would say this is my number one go-to way of analyzing organizations, because I think it reflects both the underlying elements of who's in there, but also if we want, you know, life, and Ari de Gois makes this point in his book, the fundamental purpose of life is to sustain itself. And if we want the organization to sustain and grow, then we're going to have to pay attention to this. Machines don't sustain themselves, you know, traditional machines don't. So, Ulrika, I think hopefully that answers it. I think it is a very useful model, and often usually my start go-to model.
I agree. I think all of the different sort of metaphors of thinking about organization. They, like any kind of social science theory, they are sort of like lenses that we view the world through, and they reveal different types of insights and knowledge. And one of the things that I think is more noticeable, having read Gareth Morgan's book, is how kind of hidden and pervasive the organizations as machines metaphor is, in a way that we are not aware. That even sometimes when I hear people talking about organizations as gardeners, they are still framing the gardener as sort of like a mechanic.
Yeah.
In a way that when I'm in my garden and I have like ladybugs and spiders, they are my team members. I'm never really in control of things. So we're almost out of time, but we do have one last question from Jose, which is a big question. And by the way,
Oh, yeah.
something we are going to have more sessions on in the future if you're interested in AI. But are we going to have to change how we design organizations as we integrate with AI and humans? Do you have a take on this, Paul?
Clever chap, yes, Jose. It's well, yes, we're going to have to think about it differently. I think one of the some of the power of the living organization metaphor is the way that AI has been approached from a machine point of view, and I think you can see this all over. Is we've kind of like gone to the machine and said, can this component called Paul, this component called Heather, could we replace them with the machine? Could we fully automate it, or at least speed up what they do? Type more words per minute, whatever it is. But actually, the power of AI and generative AI is not that. It's an interlinked piece. It is part of a living system, and the value of the living organization approach is that we see we're developing brand new ways of doing, ways of thinking. Could Uber be done without digital tech? No, I mean, it's not full AI, a lot of it, but could it ever be that brokering, new forms of organization that rely on that? When we see new types of applications, new ways of doing work coming up, then it's the combination of things. So I think this, almost like seeing AI as producing new capabilities, bionic arms, kind of going back to a childhood TV program, The $6 Million Man, able to run faster and do new things and jump higher. Is AI giving us brand new capabilities, brand new ways of doing things? I think it's more useful metaphor than the machine one, which is pervasive even in our AI thing, which is even that classic study about which jobs are replaceable. They looked down basically at a set of tasks and said, could this bit of what Heather does or Paul does be replaced by a machine? And I think that's an unhelpful way to think sometimes, because it's actually the combination, it's new capabilities. And it also allows us to think, what do we need to do to create that new, one of the dangers of AI is we just replace like a load of graduate jobs, but then the graduates never turn into the senior people because they never learn the skills. And what we really need is to kind of say, how does AI bring new capabilities, create our bionic organization, if you like?
Yeah, and I think there's also an element that we talked about a bit earlier, this notion of learning how to learn, which, as we're
Yes.
seeing more and more kind of reports of AI use in education, that sometimes when it's not being used in the ideal way, it can kind of sub out that whole process of struggling with something before you get good at it, that is so important to building on our capabilities as individuals and also organizations.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested if anybody's got any other questions. Thank you, Ulrika and Jose, for those questions. I'm aware of time, but
Yeah.
I just think this is a very exciting area of development. When people talk about human-centric organizations, I think one of the things that we should all kind of sit back and look at is when somebody comes to us with our organizations, or we go, are we truly bringing a whole new way of thinking? That's what I love about the whole image of a living organization, rather than just bringing some particular techniques that are more human, because we need to rethink our languages. And I find myself as a practitioner, it's sort of like, what change model am I going to use here? And I've realized that I'm bringing quite a model that's laden with rather mechanistic thinking behind it. So I think we need to, it's that kind of self-reflection on our practice we need to do a little bit, which is, well, I love your kind of gardener metaphor. We've moved from being a designer maybe to being a gardener or cultivator of the organization.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful note to end it on. So the book is Alive, Cultivating Living Organizations for Success in a Digital Age. And I really appreciate it. It was a joy to have you, Paul. And thank you to everyone for attending this session. And I hope to see you
Yeah.
at the next one.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Yeah, if anybody's looking for it, all you need to type is Alive Paul Lambert into Amazon and you'll find the book. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. And thanks for the conversation today, Heather.
You're welcome.